May 6, 1527. Rome awoke in the mist of pre-dawn twilight. The bells of the basilicas were still silent, and a deceptive quiet reigned in the streets of the Eternal City. Only a few merchants hurried to the market squares, and patrols of Swiss guards marched in measured steps along the cobblestone streets, relieving the night watch. No one suspected that this day would forever change the fate of the city and become fatal for the defenders of the papal throne. A strange tension hung in the air, as if nature itself anticipated the impending tragedy. Captain Caspar Royst, commander of the Papal Guard, stood on the balcony of his chambers, gazing at the horizon. Alarming news of the approaching imperial troops had reached the Vatican for several weeks, but few believed that Emperor Charles V's army would dare to attack Rome itself, the sacred city of the Christian world. Pope Clement VII, a man of refinement and education but not overly decisive in military matters, continued to hope for a diplomatic solution to the conflict. This morning he was praying in his private chapel when Royst arrived with another report on the state of the city's fortifications. The history of the Swiss Guard began long before the tragic events of 1527. On January 22, 1506, a detachment of 150 Swiss mercenaries, led by Captain Caspar von Silenen, entered Rome. This day is considered the official founding date of the Papal Swiss Guard. The warriors, having overcome snow-covered alpine passes, arrived by personal invitation of Pope Julius II, a pontiff known for his warlike disposition and dubbed by contemporaries the fearsome Pope. The choice of Swiss for the protection of the Holy See was not accidental. By the beginning of the 16th century, Swiss infantry had earned a reputation as the best in Europe. Their formation, armed with long pikes and halberds, was practically invincible on battlefields. The Swiss were famous not only for their combat qualities, but also for their loyalty to their employer, a quality that Pope Julius II valued no less than military prowess. The Swiss are honest and reliable people. One can count on them in any situation, the pontiff told his inner circle, explaining his choice. Indeed, at a time when political alliances in Italy changed with kaleidoscopic speed, and betrayal was considered almost a virtue in high circles, the loyalty of Swiss mercenaries seemed almost an anachronism. The first years of the Guard's existence passed relatively peacefully. The Swiss performed guard duty in the palace, accompanied the Pope during outings and ceremonies, and guarded the entrances to the Vatican. Their presence was meant not only to ensure the physical safety of the pontiff, but also to demonstrate his status and power. Already then, the characteristic appearance of the guardsmen had formed. Their uniform, according to legend designed by Michelangelo himself, was distinguished by bright blue, yellow, and red colors, the colors of the Medici family, to which the Pope belonged. The guardsmen wore berets and doublets with puffs, striped breeches and stockings. This attire, which seemed archaic even in the 16th century, became a peculiar symbol of tradition and continuity. The guardsmen's armament consisted of halberds, a formidable weapon combining the functions of a spear and an axe, short swords for close combat, and arquebuses, early firearms. In ceremonial formation, they looked impressive, and in battle, they posed a serious threat to any adversary. The first serious test for the Guard was the War of the League of Cambrai, when Pope Julius II personally led troops in the fight against the French. The Swiss guardsmen accompanied the pontiff in this campaign, protecting him in the field. It was then that a special ethos of service was formed. The guardsmen saw themselves not just as mercenaries, but as defenders of the Vicar of St. Peter on earth. After the death of Julius II in 1513, the tradition of guarding the Pope with Swiss remained. Under Pope Leo X and then under Clement VII, the Guard continued to serve, gradually becoming an integral part of the papal court. No one suspected that it was under Clement VII that the guardsmen would have to go through the most terrible ordeal and prove their loyalty at the cost of their own lives. Europe at the beginning of the 16th century resembled a chessboard, where every move of a monarch could change the fate of entire peoples. At the center of this political game were two key figures: Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and King Francis I of France. Their confrontation defined the face of European politics for decades to come and led to tragic events in Rome. Charles Habsburg, who inherited the Spanish crown, possessions in the Netherlands, Austria, and the New World, was elected Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 1519. At 20 years old, he became the ruler of a vast empire, of which it was said that the sun never sets within it. Such a concentration of power in the hands of one man upset the fragile balance of forces in Europe. Francis I, a brilliant and ambitious monarch of France, could not reconcile himself to the growing power of the Habsburgs. The French kingdom found itself practically surrounded by Charles's possessions, Spain to the west and the lands of the Holy Roman Empire to the east. This confrontation erupted into a series of conflicts known as the Italian Wars, where the rich North Italian territories were at stake. In this complex political game, the papacy occupied a special position. The Pope was not only the spiritual leader of the Catholic world, but also the secular ruler of the Papal States in central Italy. The balance of power on the Apennine Peninsula depended on his diplomatic decisions. Clement VII, who became pontiff in 1523, inherited a difficult situation. Giulio Medici, who took the name Clement VII, was an educated and refined man, but lacked the political foresight of his cousin, Pope Leo X. As a representative of the famous Florentine Medici family, he tried to maneuver between powerful monarchs, striving to preserve the independence of the Papal States and his family's influence in Florence. Initially, Clement supported Emperor Charles V. This alliance seemed logical. The emperor appeared to be the defender of the Catholic Church, especially against the backdrop of the spread of Lutheranism in the German lands. However, the decisive victory of the imperial troops over the French at the Battle of Pavia in 1525 changed the balance of power in Italy. Charles V captured King Francis himself and seemed close to establishing complete control over Italy. This frightened Clement VII, who feared an excessive strengthening of imperial power. In Italian politics, there was a principle that no external force should dominate the peninsula. In this situation, the Pope made a fateful decision: to change allies. After his release from captivity, Francis I began to form an anti-imperial coalition. In May 1526, the League of Cognac was created, which included France, the Papal States, Venice, Florence, and Milan. This step was perceived by Charles V as a betrayal by the Pope. The Emperor, a deeply religious man, was genuinely outraged that the head of the Catholic Church had allied with the French king against him, the defender of the faith. The situation was aggravated by the spread of Lutheranism in the German lands of the empire, and many German princes openly opposed papal authority. Tension escalated throughout 1526. Imperial troops in Italy, consisting predominantly of Spaniards and German Landsknechts, suffered from a severe lack of money. Charles V, fighting wars on several fronts, could not ensure regular payment of wages to his soldiers. The army, commanded by Charles de Bourbon, a French aristocrat who had sided with the emperor, was increasingly getting out of control. In early 1527, it became clear that the conflict was approaching a critical point. Imperial troops moved south through Italy, and their route unambiguously pointed to Rome. Clement VII, realizing the danger, tried to conclude a truce, but it was already too late. The army, eager for plunder, did not obey even its own commanders. The imperial army, marching on Rome in the spring of 1527, was a formidable but internally unstable force. Under the command of Constable Charles de Bourbon, warriors of various nationalities gathered, united not so much by loyalty to Emperor Charles V as by the hope of rich plunder. This army numbered about 20,000 men, an impressive figure by the standards of the time. The core of the army consisted of Spanish soldiers, veterans of the Italian campaigns, hardened in battle and known for their cruelty. Many of them had served under the legendary Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, nicknamed the Great Captain. The Spaniards were renowned for their discipline and high morale, but even their patience was wearing thin due to months of delayed pay. The second large group was the German Landsknechts, professional mercenaries, many of whom held Lutheran views. These stern warriors in colorful slashed garments, armed with two-handed swords and long pikes, hated the papacy with religious fanaticism. For them, the March on Rome was not just a military campaign, but almost a sacred mission, an opportunity to punish the Antichrist, as they called the Pope. The army was supplemented by Italian mercenaries and light cavalry. This motley rabble was united by a common problem: a catastrophic lack of money. Emperor Charles V, waging costly wars in Europe and building an empire in the New World, could not ensure regular payment of wages to his soldiers in Italy. Many warriors had not received money for months, leading to a dangerous decline in discipline. "We fight for the emperor, but we live by our sword," the soldiers would say, implying that they were forced to sustain themselves through plunder. The cities and villages of northern Italy had already experienced the burden of this. The imperial army left a trail of ruined settlements, burned farms, and plundered churches in its wake. Constable de Bourbon, a talented commander and former French aristocrat who had sided with the emperor after a conflict with King Francis, tried to keep his men in check. However, his position was precarious. The soldiers respected his military talent but obeyed only as long as he led them to plunder. In the spring of 1527, the situation became critical. The army, encamped in northern Italy, was on the verge of mutiny. The soldiers demanded either payment of overdue wages or the opportunity to compensate themselves by plundering a rich city. Their gaze increasingly turned south, to Rome, a city full of ecclesiastical treasures, cardinals' palaces, and wealthy merchant houses. At a military council held at the end of April, de Bourbon faced an ultimatum from his own captains. "Either Rome or mutiny," they declared. Faced with a choice between disobeying the emperor, who did not wish to attack the papal capital, and losing control of the army, the constable chose the lesser of two evils. On April 30th, the imperial army set out. It was a strange sight, an army without baggage trains, without siege engines, almost without cavalry. The soldiers marched lightly, knowing they could only rely on what they could seize. The march was swift. De Bourbon wanted to reach Rome before the Pope could organize a serious defense or receive aid from allies. Along the way, the army bypassed fortified cities, not wasting time on sieges. The goal was Rome, a source of untold riches in the eyes of the hungry soldiers. With each day of the march, discipline declined, and the thirst for plunder grew. The Landsknechts sang anti-papal songs, the Spaniards sharpened their swords, and the Italian mercenaries spoke of the treasures of Roman palaces. On May 5th, 1527, the vanguard of the imperial army appeared on the hills north of Rome. The Eternal City lay before them, a golden prize promising an end to their hardships. The camp was filled with excitement mixed with impatience. No one could now hold back this torrent of greed and fury. The fate of Rome and its defenders was sealed. In late April of 1527, Rome lived in anxious anticipation. Rumors of the approaching imperial army spread through the city, causing panic among its inhabitants. Many wealthy Romans hastily left the city, taking their valuables with them. Others, on the contrary, flocked under the protection of the city walls, hoping that the eternal city would withstand any enemy, as it had done many times in its long history. Pope Clement VII found himself in an extremely difficult situation. His political maneuvering between the emperor and the French king had led to Rome now being under threat. Despite the obvious danger, the pontiff believed until the very last moment in the possibility of a diplomatic solution. He sent messengers to Constable de Bourbon with offers of ransom, hoping to buy off the imperial army. Meanwhile, Captain Caspar Royst of the Swiss Guard did not share his master's optimism. An experienced warrior, he clearly understood that the imperial army, which had not received pay for months, was unlikely to be satisfied with promises. Royst ordered his guardsmen to prepare for defense. "Gentlemen, a serious trial awaits us," he addressed the guard officers at a meeting on May 3rd. "We must be ready to defend His Holiness to the last drop of blood, as our oath requires." The Swiss Guard at that moment numbered 189 men, too few to defend the entire city, but enough to protect the Vatican and ensure the Pope's safety. Royst distributed his men to key posts. Particular attention was paid to the Ponte Sant'Angelo and the approaches to St. Peter's Basilica. The guardsmen checked their weapons, sharpened their blades, and cleaned their arquebuses. Veterans shared their experience with young recruits, many of whom had never been in real combat. An atmosphere of focused determination reigned in the guard barracks. These men, who came from the mountain cantons of Switzerland, were ready to fulfill their duty. The condition of the city's fortifications caused serious concern. Rome's walls, built under Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century, were dilapidated in places and required repair. The city garrison was small, about 5,000 men, including hastily assembled militia from citizens. They were to defend a perimeter several miles long against an army outnumbering them fourfold. Renzo da Ceri, commander of the papal troops, did everything possible to strengthen the defenses. Under his leadership, breaches in the walls were mended, artillery was installed on towers, and provisions were stockpiled. However, time was catastrophically short. Moreover, there was a shortage of professional soldiers in the city. Most of the defenders consisted of poorly trained militiamen. Sentiments in Rome were contradictory. The clergy prayed for the city's salvation. Aristocrats hid in their palaces, hoping to buy off the invaders in case of a breakthrough. Ordinary citizens prepared for the worst. In the market squares, food prices soared, and cases of looting began. The city guard struggled to maintain order. The Swiss guards remained an island of stability in this sea of panic. Their red, blue, and yellow uniforms flashed in the streets, instilling some confidence in the Romans. Many citizens looked with hope at these northern warriors, whose reputation as unyielding defenders was well known. On the evening of May 5th, Captain Royst gathered all the guardsmen in the barracks courtyard. The sun was setting, painting the Vatican walls in a golden hue. The warriors lined up in perfect order, as if on parade. Royst walked along the ranks, looking into the faces of his men, young and old, veterans and recruits. "Brothers," he began, when complete silence fell, "tomorrow we face a trial for which we have prepared our entire lives. The imperial army stands at the gates of Rome. They have come not as soldiers but as pillagers. Our task is simple: to protect the Holy Father at all costs. Remember your oath and the honor of the Swiss name." The guardsmen listened in silence, only gripping their halberd shafts more tightly. Many of them understood that the chances were slim, but retreat was unthinkable. When the captain finished his speech, a priest stepped out of the ranks and conducted a brief service. The guardsmen knelt, praying to God for strength and courage in the coming trial. After the service, Royst went to report to the Pope. Clement VII received him in his chambers, where, surrounded by cardinals and secretaries, he continued his feverish attempts to find a diplomatic solution. After hearing the captain's report on the guard's readiness, the pontiff blessed him. "May God protect you, Captain," said the Pope. "I pray that your valor will not be tested and that we find a peaceful solution." Royst bowed, but deep down he knew that the Pope's prayers were unlikely to be heard. Returning to the barracks, he looked at the lights of Rome, flickering in the evening darkness. The city grew quiet, sinking into an anxious sleep. Tomorrow, these streets were to become a battlefield. At dawn on May 6, 1527, the fate of Rome and the Swiss Guard was to be decided. No one could foresee what price this day would exact from the defenders of the papal throne. May 6, 1527. Dawn over Rome broke through a fog, enveloping the city walls in a ghostly shroud. The bells were still silent when the first rays of the sun illuminated the silhouettes of the imperial troops, taking up positions for the assault. The silence was shattered by the sharp sound of trumpets, the signal to attack. The army of Constable de Bourbon moved towards the walls of the Eternal City. The first onslaught fell on the northwestern fortifications, where the city wall was particularly vulnerable. German Landsknechts, with battle cries, rushed forward, carrying scaling ladders. Spanish arquebusiers provided cover, firing aimed shots at the defenders on the walls. The Roman garrison responded with volleys from cannons and arquebuses. At this decisive moment, an event occurred that changed the course of the battle. Constable de Bourbon, wishing to inspire his soldiers, personally led them into the attack. Dressed in white armor, he was clearly visible against the gray walls. As de Bourbon ascended the scaling ladder, a stray bullet, fired, according to some accounts, by the jeweler Benvenuto Cellini, struck him in the thigh. "Forward, my brave men! Victory will be ours!" the constable managed to cry out before collapsing from the ladder. His body was wrapped in a cloak and carried from the battlefield. News of the commander's death quickly spread among the imperial troops. But instead of demoralizing the soldiers, it ignited in them a thirst for revenge. Cried the Landsknechts, rushing to the assault with redoubled fury. Spanish veterans, usually reserved and disciplined, now plunged into battle with a frenzy that even their officers had not expected. On the section of the wall near Borgo, where the defense was particularly weak, the imperial troops managed to breach it. Several dozen Landsknechts burst inside, pushing back the few defenders. They quickly widened the breach, allowing the main forces to pour into the city. Almost simultaneously, the Spaniards overcame the wall elsewhere, using scaling ladders. The Roman garrison faltered under this double blow. The poorly trained militia, who made up the majority of the defenders, began to retreat, and then fled entirely. Professional soldiers tried to organize a defense in the streets, but there were too few of them to stop the avalanche of enemy troops. The first reports of the enemy's breakthrough reached the Vatican around 8 in the morning. A messenger, covered in dust and blood, burst into the palace shouting, "They've broken through! Imperial troops are in the city! All is lost!" Pope Clement VII was at that moment listening to Mass in his private chapel. Hearing the cries, he interrupted the service and went into the corridor, where Captain Caspar Royst was already waiting for him with several guards. "Your Holiness, the enemy has breached the defenses," Royst reported, kneeling. "We must immediately ensure your safety. Please follow me to Castel Sant'Angelo." The Pope paled but maintained his composure. He quickly gave orders to his secretaries to gather important documents and church relics. Cardinals present in the palace panicked, rushing through the corridors, unsure what to do. Meanwhile, a true nightmare unfolded in the streets of Rome. The imperial troops, meeting no organized resistance, split into small detachments and moved deeper into the city. They broke into houses and churches, seizing all valuables in their path. Residents, terrified, tried to hide or flee. In the Vatican, the Swiss guards hastily took up defensive positions. Royst divided his men into two groups. The larger part was to ensure the Pope's retreat to Castel Sant'Angelo. The smaller was to delay the enemy to buy time. "Remember your oath," the captain addressed the guards remaining to provide cover. "Today you are defending not just a man, but the Vicar of St. Peter on earth." The guards, lined up in the square before the cathedral, silently nodded. They understood that they were most likely seeing each other for the last time. Their halberds and swords were ready for battle, and their souls for meeting their Creator. In the distance, shouts and gunshots were already heard. Imperial troops were approaching the Vatican. The fateful dawn of May 6, 1527, was turning into a day that would forever change the fate of Rome and the Papal Swiss Guard. The ringing of bells on St. Peter's Tower stopped mid-note. Captain Roust, standing on the basilica steps, sharply turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. A young guardsman ran towards him, his face contorted with fear. Roust gripped the hilt of his sword. This was the moment he both feared and awaited. Now everything became crystal clear. Diplomacy was over. The struggle for survival had begun. The guardsmen saluted and rushed to execute the order. Roust surveyed St. Peter's Square. Only yesterday it had been crowded, now it was deserted. Only a few priests hurried to take refuge within the basilica walls, and Swiss patrols were taking up defensive positions. An atmosphere of panic reigned in the papal chambers. Secretaries hastily gathered documents, servants scurried between rooms, cardinals loudly debated what to do next. Clement VII, pale but maintaining his dignity, stood by the window, peering into the haze over the city. "Your Holiness," Roust knelt, "imperial troops have broken into the city. We must immediately move you to Castel Sant'Angelo." The Pope slowly turned. A mixture of fear and resignation was in his eyes. "How much time do we have, Captain?" "No more than an hour, Holy Father, possibly less." Clement nodded and addressed the cardinals. "Gentlemen, follow Captain Roust. He will ensure our safety." While the most valuable relics and documents were being gathered in the papal chambers, in St. Peter's Square, the Swiss guards prepared for defense. Lieutenant Conrad Hertz, a veteran of the Italian wars, arranged his men in a semicircle before the cathedral entrance. His 50-man detachment was to be the last line of defense. Hertz commanded. The guardsmen silently took positions. Many of them had arrived from Switzerland only a few months ago and had never participated in a real battle. However, years of training and iron discipline did their part. The formation looked impeccable. Lieutenant Caspar Goldley, with his 30-man detachment, took up position by the fountain in the square. His task was to cover the flank of the main forces and, if necessary, ensure a retreat to the secret corridor leading to Castel Sant'Angelo. "Remember, brothers," Goldley addressed his men, "today we fight not just for the Pope, but for the very idea of loyalty. The whole world will judge the Swiss by our actions." In the distance, shouts and gunshots were already audible. Smoke rose above the rooftops of Borgo. Imperial troops methodically advanced towards the center of the papal domains, leaving plundered homes and churches in their wake. Captain Royst returned to the square accompanied by 50 guardsmen. Behind them followed the Pope, cardinals, and several high-ranking clergymen. Clement VII was dressed in a simple cassock to avoid drawing attention if he encountered the enemy. "Hertz! Goldley!" Royst called the lieutenants over. "I am taking the Pope and cardinals to Castel Sant'Angelo." Your task is to hold back the enemy for as long as possible. When you receive my signal, 3 shots from the tower, retreat through the secret corridor." The lieutenants nodded, understanding that their chances of surviving until that signal were slim. "May God keep you," Royst added, shaking hands with his officers. As the papal procession moved towards the secret entrance of the Passetto corridor, connecting the Vatican with Castel Sant'Angelo, the first refugees from the captured areas appeared in the square. Women with children, priests, nuns, all sought refuge under the shadow of the cathedral. Lieutenant Hertz ordered them to be let in, though he understood this would complicate the defense. He told his aide, pointing to the weeping women. Suddenly, loud shouts in German and Spanish erupted from Borgo Santo Spirito Street. The vanguard of the imperial troops entered the square. These were Landsknechts, German mercenaries in brightly slashed clothing, armed with long pikes and 2-handed swords. Behind them followed Spanish arquebusiers in dark armor. Hertz commanded, and the Swiss guards formed up for battle. The Landsknechts paused for a moment, assessing the enemy's strength. Their commander, a tall, bearded man in a helmet with a red plume, rode forward on horseback. "Hey, Swiss!" he shouted in broken Italian. "Drop your weapons! The Pope won't pay you another penny! Join us, and together we'll plunder this den of the Antichrist!" Hertz stepped a few paces out of formation. "We swore allegiance to the Holy See," he replied loudly. "The Swiss do not betray their employer. Leave while you can." The Landsknecht commander laughed and turned to his men. "Did you hear? These mountain shepherds are going to defend the Pope. Let's show them how real warriors fight." With a wild roar, the Landsknechts charged. Hertz barely managed to return to formation when the Swiss arquebuses fired a volley. Several attackers fell, but the main body continued to advance. When the distance closed to a few meters, the halberdiers engaged. St. Peter's Square turned into a battlefield. The clang of metal, the cries of the wounded, the roar of gunshots, all merged into a cacophony of battle. The Swiss held their ground, their long halberds creating a deadly barrier for the attackers. But with each passing minute, more imperial soldiers arrived. They came from different streets, drawn by the sounds of battle. Goldley's detachment by the fountain engaged with Spanish soldiers trying to outflank the main Swiss forces. The guardsmen fought with desperate resolve, understanding that the fate of the Pope and the entire Catholic Church depended on their steadfastness. "Hold the line!" Goldley shouted, parrying blows from a Spanish sword. "Not one step back!" Meanwhile, Captain Royst, with the main group of guardsmen, successfully led the Pope and cardinals through the secret Passetto corridor. This narrow passage, built specifically for the evacuation of pontiffs in times of danger, stretched 800 meters from the Vatican to the massive Castel Sant'Angelo. As they reached the middle of the corridor, shouts erupted behind them. A group of Landsknechts had discovered the entrance and rushed in pursuit. "Faster, Your Holiness!" Royst supported the weakened Pope by the arm. 10 guardsmen remained to cover the retreat, lining up across the corridor. In the narrow space, their halberds created an impassable barrier. They understood they were condemning themselves to death, but they did not hesitate for a second. On May 6, 1527, St. Peter's Square became a battlefield. 147 Swiss guards formed a semicircle on the wide marble steps of the cathedral. Their bright blue, yellow, and red uniforms sharply contrasted with the gray stone and the dark sky, obscured by smoke from fires. Captain Royst had managed to lead Pope Clement VII to the Castel Sant'Angelo, leaving the main body of his men to cover the retreat. Lieutenant Hertz, taking command of the remaining guardsmen, arranged them in 3 ranks. The first, with long pikes, creating an impenetrable wall of sharp points. The second, with halberds, ready to chop and stab. The third, with arquebuses, loaded with large grape shot. This was classic Swiss tactics, proven effective in dozens of battles across Europe.
"Hold the line!" Hertz yelled, walking along the rank. "Remember your oath! Remember the honor of Switzerland!"
From the opposite side of the square appeared the first detachment of imperial troops, about 200 Landsknechts under the command of Captain Wilhelm von Sandizel. The German mercenaries stopped, assessing their opponents. Many of them were Lutherans and saw the Pope as the embodiment of the Antichrist. For them, this battle was not just a military operation, but a sacred mission. "Swiss dogs!" shouted von Sandizel. "Lay down your arms and we will spare your lives. Your devil Pope has fled, abandoning you to your deaths." In response, the Swiss only closed ranks tighter. A young drummer began to beat a rhythm, slow, measured, setting the pace for breathing and heartbeat. This sound, familiar to every Swiss warrior from childhood, gave strength and confidence. Without waiting for a reply, the Landsknechts moved to attack. They advanced in a wide front, brandishing two-handed swords and shouting battle cries. When they were about 30 paces from the Swiss formation, Hertz gave the signal to the arquebusiers. A volley thundered, and the first row of attackers collapsed onto the cobblestones of the square. The smoke from the shots momentarily obscured the battlefield, but the Landsknechts did not stop. Stepping over the bodies of fallen comrades, they continued their advance. When the smoke cleared, two walls of pikes and halberds collided with a deafening clang of metal on metal. Hand-to-hand combat began. The Swiss held their ground, their movements honed by years of training. Each knew his place and his task. They fought not as a collection of mercenaries, but as a single organism, where each part supported the other. The Landsknechts, on the other hand, relied on individual skill and ferocity. Their two-handed swords shattered pike shafts, their armor withstood halberd blows, but the organized Swiss formation prevented them from breaking through to the cathedral steps. Soon, reinforcements arrived in the square. A detachment of Spanish soldiers under the command of Captain Diego de Mendoza. The Spanish were renowned for their discipline and tactical skill. De Mendoza quickly assessed the situation and ordered his arquebusiers to take positions on the flanks to fire upon the Swiss formation from the side. "They're trying to surround us!" shouted one of the Swiss officers. "Lieutenant, we need to regroup!" Hertz understood the danger. If the Spanish attacked from the flanks, the Swiss formation would be broken in minutes. He ordered some of his men to turn and form a square, a defensive formation, protected on all sides. This maneuver came at a high cost. While the guardsmen regrouped, the Landsknechts intensified their assault. Several Swiss fell, pierced by long swords, but the square was formed, and now the guardsmen could repel attacks from all directions. The battle on the cathedral steps had already lasted more than an hour. The square was strewn with the bodies of the fallen from both sides. Blood streamed down the marble steps, staining them crimson. The Swiss fought in silence, saving their breath for the fight. Their opponents, on the contrary, were not sparing with curses and threats. "Surrender, fools!" shouted von Sandizel. "There are only 100 of you against thousands. You will all die here." "Then we will die with honor," Hertz quietly replied, wiping blood from his face. By noon, the Swiss position had become critical. Their ranks had dwindled to 80 men. The arquebuses had long since fallen silent. Powder and shot had run out. Only cold steel and a determination to stand to the end remained. At that moment, a new detachment appeared in the square. Italian mercenaries under the command of Captain Fabrizio Colonna. They joined the besiegers, attacking the Swiss square from a third side. Now the guardsmen were completely surrounded. But even in this hopeless situation, they did not flinch. Each Swiss was worth a dozen ordinary soldiers. Their halberds described deadly arcs sweeping away attackers. Their short swords found gaps in the enemy's armor. They fell one by one, but took many opponents with them. By midday, fewer than 50 of the original 147 guardsmen remained. They retreated to the upper steps of the cathedral, forming a last line of defense. Their uniforms were torn and soaked with blood, their own and others. Many were wounded, but continued to fight. At that moment, 3 cannon shots rang out from the tower of Castel Sant'Angelo, a signal from Captain Royst. The Pope was safe. The guardsman's mission was accomplished. Hertz, who had received several wounds by then, gathered the surviving officers around him.
"Brothers, we have done all we could," he said quietly. "The Holy Father is safe. Now each must decide for himself, to continue the fight or to try to break through to the Castel Sant'Angelo." Most chose to stay. Only a small group of 15 men under the command of Junior Lieutenant Caspar Royst Jr., the captain's son, attempted to break through the besiegers' ring to a secret entrance to the Passetto corridor. Their breakthrough was desperate and bloody. Forming a wedge, they rushed down the steps, cutting a path through enemy ranks. 7 fell in the first few minutes, but the rest continued. When they reached the corridor entrance, only 4 remained alive, including a severely wounded Royst Jr. While a bloody drama unfolded on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, Captain Caspar Royst, with a small detachment of guards, hastily escorted Pope Clement VII through the secret Passetto corridor. This narrow passage, built at the end of the 13th century specifically for the evacuation of pontiffs in times of danger, connected the Vatican to the massive Castel Sant'Angelo, an ancient fortress on the banks of the Tiber. The corridor was cramped and poorly lit. Sparse torches, set in wall niches, cast unsettling shadows on the stone walls. The air was stale, smelling of dampness and mold. Pope Clement, an elderly man unaccustomed to physical exertion, struggled to keep pace with the rapidly moving guards. "Your Holiness, we must move faster," Royst quietly uttered, supporting the pontiff by the elbow. "The imperial troops could discover the corridor's entrance at any moment." Clement merely nodded, breathing heavily. Several cardinals and papal secretaries followed them, along with a guard of 20 guardsmen. Another 10 Swiss guards went ahead, checking the path. The remaining guards covered the retreat in St. Peter's Square. When they had covered about half the distance, shouts and the clang of weapons echoed from behind. Royst sharply turned around. In the dim torchlight, he saw the last guardsman of the rear guard holding back the onslaught of their pursuers. The imperial soldiers had somehow discovered the entrance to the secret corridor and were now chasing the papal procession. Royst commanded. 3 young guardsmen unhesitatingly took up positions in the narrow passage. Their halberds blocked the corridor from wall to wall, creating an impassable barrier. In such a confined space, even 3 determined warriors could hold back dozens of enemies. One of the cardinals said as he passed them, replied the eldest of the remaining guardsmen, a young man named Ulrich Zwingli, nephew of the famous reformer. The papal procession continued its journey. The corridor gradually ascended, following the contours of the hill. The sounds of battle behind them grew fainter until they ceased altogether. No one discussed the fate of their left-behind comrades. It was obvious. Suddenly, one of the guardsmen in front cried out and fell. An arrow had pierced his neck clean through. At that very moment, several Landsknechte sprang from a side passage whose existence, it seemed, no one had known about. Royst cried, drawing his sword. The guards instantly formed a human shield around the Pope and cardinals. A brutal struggle unfolded in the cramped corridor. The Swiss fought with desperate determination, understanding there was no retreat.
Their short swords and daggers proved more effective in the confined space than the long blades of the Landsknechte. Royst personally struck down 3 attackers, but received a deep wound in his shoulder. Blood streamed down his arm, making the sword hilt slippery. Beside him, the other guardsmen fought, pushing back the enemy, step by step. One of the Swiss cried as the last Landsknecht fell under the blows of a halberd. Royst quickly assessed the losses. 5 of his men lay on the stone floor. Another 3 were wounded but could move. The Pope and cardinals were unharmed, though pale with fear and shock. The captain said, bandaging his wound with a piece of cloth torn from his cloak. They continued their journey, now moving even more cautiously. Every side passage, every niche was thoroughly checked before they passed by. The wounded guardsmen gritted their teeth, not allowing pain to slow their movement. Pope Clement, shaken by the violence he had witnessed, walked silently, lost in prayer. Finally, a light appeared ahead. They were approaching the exit of the corridor, leading into Castel Sant'Angelo. The last few meters were particularly difficult. Fatigue and tension took their toll. Even the trained guardsmen moved slower. When they reached the massive door leading to the lower chambers of the castle, they were met by the fortress commandant, Benvenuto Cellini, the famous jeweler and sculptor who had taken on the organization of the defense. "Your Holiness!" Cellini exclaimed, kneeling. "Thank God you are safe!" The Pope blessed him with a trembling hand and went inside. The cardinals and secretaries followed him. Royst remained at the door, looking at his exhausted men. "You have done your duty," he said quietly. "Now our task is to protect the Holy Father here, in the castle." One of the young guardsmen looked at the captain with anxiety in his eyes. "What about the others, those who remained at the cathedral?" Royst shook his head. He knew the answer but did not want to speak it aloud. Instead, he ordered, "Go up to the tower and give the signal. 3 cannon shots. That was the agreed-upon sign for those who might still be alive." Soon, 3 cannon volleys thundered over Rome. This sound reached St. Peter's Square, where the last Swiss guards were still holding back the onslaught of the imperial troops. For them, it was a sign that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The Pope had reached a safe refuge. In Castel Sant'Angelo, Clement VII ascended to the upper tier to look out at the city. What he saw shocked him to the core. Rome, the eternal city, was burning. Black smoke rose from dozens of buildings. Even at that distance, shouts and gunshots could be heard. "Lord, what have I done?" the Pope whispered, gazing at the unfolding tragedy. The 6th of May, 1527, forever entered the history of Rome as a day of unimaginable horror. When the last Swiss guards fell on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, an era of nightmares began for the Eternal City, lasting for many months. Imperial troops, deprived of unified command after the death of Constable de Bourbon, turned into an uncontrollable horde of marauders. As soon as the sun began to set, Rome was already ablaze with dozens of fires. Smoke shrouded the sky in a black shroud, through which the crimson sun seemed like a wound in the body of the heavens. Landsknechts and Spanish soldiers, intoxicated by victory and wine from plundered cellars, roamed the streets in groups of 5 to 10, breaking into homes and churches. These cries echoed throughout the city, accompanied by the clang of smashing glass and the crack of splintering doors. German Lutheran Landsknechts were particularly ferocious, for whom the sacking of Rome was not merely a military operation, but a religious act against the churches were subjected to particular desecration. Precious relics were thrown into the streets, altars were used as dining tables, and wine was drunk from chalices. Some Landsknechts donned papal vestments and staged blasphemous processions, parodying Catholic rites. In the Basilica of St. John Lateran, soldiers smashed an ancient mosaic, believing treasures were hidden beneath it. Monasteries and convents suffered particularly brutal attacks. Nuns were subjected to cruel treatment. Many preferred death to dishonor. The abbess of the monastery of St. Cecilia in Trastevere gathered her sisters in the chapel, and when the Landsknechts broke down the doors, she ordered them to cover their faces with their hands so as not to see what would follow. The palaces of cardinals and aristocrats were plundered with particular thoroughness. Soldiers pierced walls and floors with daggers in search of hiding places, ripped down tapestries, and smashed statues in search of hidden jewels. Libraries and art collections, amassed by generations of enlightened patrons, were destroyed or plundered. Manuscripts were used to fuel fires on which food was cooked. The civilian population sought refuge wherever they could. Some managed to hide in the catacombs, ancient underground burial sites of the early Christians. Others fled the city, risking capture by imperial patrols. Many simply hid in cellars and secret rooms in their homes, praying not to be discovered. The fate of the surviving Swiss guards was tragic. The few who managed to survive the battle on the cathedral steps were taken prisoner. Imperial soldiers, respecting their bravery, offered them to join their ranks. Every single one refused, preferring death to betraying their oath. They were executed in Piazza Navona, forced to watch the desecration of papal relics before their death. 4 guards, including young Reist, who managed to reach Castel Sant'Angelo, brought terrible news of their comrades' deaths. Captain Caspar Reist, learning of his son's death, shed no tear. Only his fingers, gripping the hilt of his sword, whitened with tension. That night he wrote a letter to Switzerland, detailing the heroism of his men. "They died as heroes," he wrote, "faithful to their oath to their last breath. Let Switzerland be proud of such sons. Their blood has forever consecrated the steps of St. Peter's Basilica." Castel Sant'Angelo, a massive fortress on the banks of the Tiber, became an island of resistance in the captured city. Here, the Pope, about 30 cardinals, several hundred clerics and laypeople, as well as the remnants of the Swiss Guard, took refuge. Imperial troops tried to storm the fortress several times, but its thick walls and well-organized defense made this task virtually impossible without heavy artillery. From the windows of the upper floors of the castle, Pope Clement VII could see what was happening to his city. The smoke from the fires, the screams of the victims, the ringing of bells, which were rung not by schedule, but in a desperate attempt to call for help. All this tormented the pontiff's soul. He spent long hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for the political mistakes that led to this catastrophe. The sack of Rome continued for 8 days with unabated fury. Then, when the most obvious valuables had already been seized, the violence subsided somewhat, but did not cease entirely. Imperial soldiers quartered themselves in the city, occupying palaces and wealthy homes. They demanded ransom from the owners, threatening complete destruction of property. By the end of May, diseases began to spread in Rome. Unburied bodies, unsanitary conditions, and a lack of clean water led to an outbreak of fever, which struck down both the local population and the occupiers. This, along with food shortages, somewhat cooled the ardor of the conquerors. Many soldiers, having plundered enough valuables, deserted, seeking to return home as rich men. The siege of Castel Sant'Angelo continued until June 6th, when Pope Clement VII was forced to capitulate. The terms of surrender were harsh. Payment of an enormous tribute, transfer of several fortresses, and renunciation of the alliance with France. The pontiff effectively became a prisoner of Emperor Charles V. However, even after the Pope's capitulation, the imperial troops did not fully leave Rome. They remained in the city until February 1528, continuing plundering and violence, albeit on a smaller scale. During this time, the population of Rome decreased from 55,000 to 30,000 people. Many died, others fled, and still others succumbed to disease and starvation. The cultural losses proved to be irreparable. Priceless manuscripts, works of art, and historical relics were destroyed or dispersed into private collections throughout Europe. Libraries, collected over centuries, burned in the flames of fires. Frescoes and mosaics, which had survived a millennium, were barbarically destroyed in search of hidden treasures. The sack of Rome had far-reaching consequences for all of Europe. This event marked the end of the High Renaissance in Italy. Many artists and scholars who survived the horrors of 1527 left Rome, taking their talents to other cities and countries. For the Catholic Church, the Sacco di Roma became a moment of deep crisis and re-evaluation. The fact that the troops of a Catholic emperor plundered the Holy City and held the successor of St. Peter captive dealt a severe blow to the authority of the papacy. This event indirectly contributed to the success of the Reformation, demonstrating Rome's weakness in the face of military might. The tragedy of May 6, 1527, forever changed the Swiss Guard. Of the 189 guardsmen, only 42 remained alive, those who accompanied Pope Clement VII to the Castel Sant'Angelo and stayed there throughout the long siege. After his release from captivity, the Pope began to restore not only the ruined Rome, but also his personal guard. The heroism of the Swiss, who gave their lives on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, became the cornerstone of the Guard's new identity. From then on, they were not merely mercenaries in the service of the pontiff, but guardians of a sacred tradition of self-sacrifice. Captain Caspar Royst, who lost his son in that battle, developed a new statute for the Guard. The selection of candidates became stricter. Only men from Catholic cantons of Switzerland, with an impeccable reputation and recommendations from local priests, were accepted. The training of recruits included not only military skills, but also a deep understanding of the Catholic faith and the history of the papacy. Special attention was paid to stories of the heroic defense of May 6th, which became an almost sacred narrative for every recruit. The most significant innovation was the oath-taking ceremony for new guardsmen. By decision of Pope Clement VII, it was to be held annually on May 6th, in memory of fallen comrades. The first such ceremony took place on May 6, 1528, exactly 1 year after the tragedy. Recruits in ceremonial uniform lined up on those very steps of St. Peter's Basilica where their predecessors fought their last battle. To the sound of drums and trumpets, in the presence of the Pope and cardinals, they raised 3 fingers of their right hand, a symbol of the Holy Trinity, and pronounced the words of the oath. "I swear to faithfully, honestly, and conscientiously serve the reigning Supreme Pontiff and his lawful successors, and to dedicate myself to them with all my being, ready to sacrifice, if necessary, my life for their defense. I undertake the same obligations towards the Sacred College of Cardinals during the vacancy of the Holy See. Furthermore, I pledge to observe all the norms prescribed to me by this oath, and to conscientiously fulfill everything it requires of me." This tradition has survived to this day, becoming one of the most impressive ceremonies in the Vatican. After the sack of Rome, the guardsmen's weaponry also changed. If previously they relied primarily on halberds and short swords, now more modern weapons, muskets and pistols, were adopted. Tactics also changed. Guardsmen began to pay more attention to protection against sudden attacks and the evacuation of the pontiff along prearranged routes. The experience of using the secret Passetto corridor showed the need for multiple retreat paths in case of emergency. The guardsman's uniform also underwent changes. The traditional blue, yellow, and red colors remained, but the clothing became more practical and comfortable for combat. The ceremonial uniform, reputedly designed by Michelangelo himself, was used only for ceremonies, while more functional uniforms were introduced for daily service. Especially noticeable was the change in the ethos of service. If before 1527, guardsmen saw themselves primarily as professional soldiers fulfilling a contract, now service in the Guard acquired an almost religious dimension. To be a Swiss Guard meant to be part of a brotherhood cemented by the blood of martyrs who gave their lives for faith and duty. Captain Royst, who mourned his fallen son and comrades for the rest of his life, often told recruits, "You are not just guarding a man, but guarding the vicar of Christ on earth. Remember this every minute of your service." These words became the unofficial motto of the Guard. The influence of the 1527 events also extended to relations between the Swiss Confederation and the Papal States. The heroism of the Guardsmen strengthened the ties between the Catholic cantons of Switzerland and the Holy See. In 1529, a new treaty was signed, regulating the service of the Swiss in the Vatican and guaranteeing special privileges for the families of guardsmen. The memory of the fallen heroes was preserved not only in the Vatican, but also in their hometowns and villages. In the Swiss cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, memorial chapels and stela with the names of the deceased were erected. Local residents proudly told stories of their countrymen who defended the Pope at the cost of their own lives. These stories were passed down from generation to generation, forming a special attitude toward service in the Papal Guard. For many Swiss families, having a son in the Guard became the highest honor, almost like having a son who was a priest. Over time, a whole complex of traditions and rituals developed around the events of May 6, 1527. Annually on this day, a solemn Mass is held in the Vatican in memory of the fallen guardsmen. After the Mass, recruits take their oath, and veterans lay wreaths at the memorial plaque at the foot of St. Peter's Basilica. On this day, guardsmen wear a special mourning uniform with black armbands, and their weapons are adorned with black ribbons. In the evening, a private ceremony is held in the Guard barracks, where the names of the 147 fallen heroes are read aloud and a candle is lit for each. The tradition of self-sacrifice, established in 1527, has been repeatedly demonstrated in the subsequent history of the Guard. During the Napoleonic Wars, when French troops invaded the Papal States, the Guardsmen again rose to defend the pontiff. In the 20th century, during World War II, they ensured the security of the Vatican, surrounded by fascist Italy. Each time, the Guardsmen demonstrated their readiness to give their lives for their employer, following the example of their predecessors. The modern Swiss Guard, despite all technological changes in armament and tactics, remains true to the traditions established after the tragedy of 1527. Today, it is the only active army in the world wearing Renaissance-era uniforms and using halberds for ceremonial purposes, weapons with which their predecessors defended Pope Clement VII. Every guardsman knows the history of the sack of Rome and the feat of the 147 heroes. For them, it is not just a page in a history textbook, but a living tradition that defines their identity and the meaning of their service. As one modern captain of the Guard said, "We protect not only the physical safety of the Holy Father, but also the memory of those who showed the world what true loyalty means." Today, almost 5 centuries after the events of May 6, 1527, the Swiss Guard continues to serve in the Vatican, remaining the last active military formation of a medieval type in the world. Every year, on the anniversary of the tragedy, new recruits swear an oath of allegiance to the pontiff in the very square where their predecessors gave their lives protecting Pope Clement VII. This ceremony is not merely a tribute to tradition. It reminds us of the enduring values of loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice, which in our era of pragmatism and calculation seem almost anachronistic. However, it is precisely these values that form the spiritual core of the Swiss Guard even today. Modern guardsmen wear the same bright blue, yellow, and red uniform, carry the same halberds, and take the same oath as their ancestors. But beneath this outward immutability lies a meticulously crafted 21st century security system. Today's Swiss Guards undergo special anti-terrorism training, are proficient with modern weapons, and utilize the latest security technologies. Halberds and swords remain symbols, but bulletproof vests are concealed beneath ceremonial uniforms, and modern firearms are stored in the barracks. To become a guard today, one must meet strict requirements. Be a Swiss citizen, a Catholic, have an impeccable reputation, have served in the Swiss Army, and be no younger than 19 and no older than 30 years old. The term of service is a minimum of 2 years. Competition for a place in the Guard remains high. For many young Swiss, it is not just a job, but a calling and an honor. In Switzerland, the memory of the events of 1527 is especially cherished. In the Catholic cantons from which guardsmen are traditionally recruited, families proudly preserve relics of ancestors who served in the Vatican. In the city of Lucerne, there is a museum of the Swiss Guard, where documents, weapons, and uniforms from different eras are collected. Here also stands a memorial with the names of all the guardsmen who died on May 6th. For the Catholic Church, the feet of the Swiss became a symbol of fidelity and devotion to faith. In sermons and teachings, the example of the guardsmen who gave their lives for the Pope is often cited as an example of Christian self-sacrifice. Many theologians draw a parallel between this historical event and the gospel parable of the Good Shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. In a modern world where values are often blurred and loyalty is considered an outdated concept, the history of the Swiss Guard takes on a special resonance. It reminds us that there are things for which people are willing to give their most precious possession, their life. Be it fidelity to an oath, devotion to an idea, or the defense of what one believes in. Every year, thousands of tourists observe the changing of the Swiss Guard at the entrance to the Vatican, unaware of the dramatic history behind this colorful spectacle. For them, the guardsmen are part of the tourist atmosphere, a picturesque element for photographs. But beneath this outward appearance lies a deep history of loyalty and self-sacrifice. Despite all the changes in the world, the Guard's main mission remains unchanged: to protect the pontiff at all costs. This mission was tested by blood in 1527 and has never since been questioned. In an era when loyalty is often bought and sold, such unwavering fidelity seems almost incredible. Perhaps this is the main lesson of the tragedy of 5 centuries ago. Loyalty is not an abstract concept, but a concrete choice that a person makes at a critical moment. A choice between life and honor, between security and duty. The Swiss Guards on May 6, 1527, made their choice without hesitation, and this choice still inspires their descendants who serve in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica.